That night, the rain didn't fall on Baltimore like ordinary rain. It hammered the pavement, as if it meant to erase the whole city, each surge of water icy, steady, and vicious, dragging along the distant wail of a ship's horn out by the harbor and the wet, rusty metal smell rising from the dark alleys. Brielle hurried on in a thin coat soaked through, one hand fighting to hold a cheap umbrella that the wind kept bending backward, the other hand clamped around her bag as if letting go would mean her entire life would slide into the mud. Her phone had just buzzed in her pocket, leaving behind a message as short and final as a sentence. A last notice, a hospital debt, and the reminder that if she was late again, they would process it according to procedure. She didn't dare park near work. She didn't dare spend one more dollar. So she walked the long way around, through the warehouse district, to avoid fees and avoid a ticket. Each step heavy, as if she were dragging chains. Then, just as she skirted a black puddle spilling from an open drain, her heel slipped on an oily sheen, her body pitched sideways, and her hip slammed hard into a black SUV sitting motionless in the shadows. A shrill, tearing screech split the rain when the metal clasp on her bag carved a long line across the door, glossy as a mirror. Brielle froze. A pale scratch flared into view, cruel and unmistakable, like a scar on something perfect in a way that felt almost unreal. This alley sat at the exact hidden corner of the harbor, a blind spot where even the streetlights seemed too tired to reach. No cameras, no passers-by, no witnesses. She could have simply turned away, run back to her old car, and vanished into the rain. No one would know, no one would trace it back. But Brielle couldn't move, as if an invisible hand had settled on both her shoulders and held her in place. In her mind, a voice rose that she thought she'd buried long ago. Being poor wasn't an excuse to become dirty, and dignity was what you held on to when you had nothing left to lose. Her hands shook as she pulled out a crumpled scrap of paper, scribbled a rushed apology, wrote down her phone number, then carefully tucked it into a plastic bag and slid it under the windshield wiper, as if she were placing her own name on a blade. For one brief second, that paper lay still against the cold glass, small, yet as heavy as a confession in court. And then Brielle turned and ran, her heart pounding until she could barely breathe, never knowing that only a few steps away, in the darkness of a passage between two warehouses, a man stood motionless in the rain with two bodyguards, watching every movement she made without the slightest hurry. In this city, people still ran when they did wrong. People still lied to survive. And yet she had left her name behind, on the car of a man the entire harbor spoke of only in a whisper. If you're hooked by this opening, don't forget to hit like for me. If you thought it was good, share it so your friends can listen too. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The next morning, Brielle woke while the sky was still lead gray, and the sound of rain had retreated. Yet the cold felt lodged in her bones, clinging to her skin exactly like last night's fear that hadn't had time to dissolve. The moment her eyes opened, she reached for her phone by sheer survival reflex, and just as she'd expected, the screen showed notifications piling up like a jagged shard of glass pressed against her throat, repeating the hospital debt and an indifferent line that the file would be moved into the recovery process if she kept delaying, leaving her throat dry and raw as if she'd swallowed sand. She dressed in silence, trying not to look at the shoes that were still damp and the coat that still carried the faint smell of wet, rusted metal from last night's warehouse district. As though one glance would raise the memory again, the shrill scrape and the white scratch across that glossy surface. On the way to the port, Brielle startled at every sound. A car door slamming was enough to knock her heartbeat off rhythm, and whenever a black vehicle passed, she instinctively lowered her head like someone afraid of being called by name. She stepped into the dispatch area before the sun had managed to warm the harbor, the wind carrying the smell of sea and engine oil blowing straight into her face, stinging her eyes. But the heaviest weight wasn't the wind. It was the thought that, somewhere, someone had seen the note she'd left under the windshield wiper. Brielle hadn't even sat down at her desk when Sloane appeared, as if she didn't walk so much as slide out from the building's dark seams, hair neat, lipstick perfect, and eyes so cold that a single glance could make you feel smaller. Sloane dropped a stack of papers onto Brielle's desk, with a light release that still sounded like a hammer strike, then smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said a container was being held outside because the manifest was wrong. The partner was furious, and if it wasn't handled before noon, the contract would be cut, and she knew exactly whose head it would land on first. Brielle opened her mouth to say she wasn't the primary person in charge, But Sloane cut her off with a voice sweet as honey mixed with poison, saying everyone was busy, saying she was new so she had to prove herself, and saying if she couldn't do it, she could pack up her things before someone else had to do it for her. Brielle took the papers, her hands slightly unsteady but refusing to show it, and she moved fast out to the container yard, where massive metal blocks formed corridors like a maze, forklifts squealing over wet concrete, and a ship's horn echoing in the distance, like a warning to hurry. A port security officer stopped her at the row being held, pointed to the red notice, and said the manifest didn't match the system. The seal listed in the file didn't match the seal on the container, and when it didn't match, the rule was the rule. The container stayed still until there was verification. Hearing that, Brielle felt her stomach tighten, because she knew in this world, one small wrong mark was enough to grind a person down, especially someone like her, with no one behind her to shield her. She drew a deep breath, opened the stack, and scanned line by line the way someone rereads her own life. And the longer she looked, the more she felt something was off in a way that was too clean. On the printout, the container's identification code ended with one character, but on the system display, it ended with a different character. And at first glance, it looked like a simple entry mistake, but when Brielle cross-checked the seal number, she found the paper used a different sequence than the seal number recorded on the handoff report out in the yard, off by exactly one character, a difference so delicate that anyone rushing would never catch it. She lifted her gaze, looked at the seal locked on the container door, then looked back at the paper, and a cold thought ran straight up her spine. Because this kind of discrepancy didn't look like carelessness. It looked like a hand deliberately nudging everything just far enough out of line that when it broke, people would see only her error. Sloane stood a few steps away, arms crossed, pretending to be busy talking to someone, but her eyes kept flicking toward Brielle as if waiting for the moment she collapsed. Brielle turned back, about to ask records for the original copy, when a man's voice, rough and unhurried, came from the guard desk at the edge of the corridor, not loud, but clear enough to cut through the machinery, telling her she should look at the cameras before she looked at people. Brielle turned her head and saw Walter, the older security guard, slightly stooped but with eyes alert as if he'd seen too much to be fooled, leaning against the booth with a cup of cold coffee in his hand. He watched Brielle for a beat as if weighing her, then said something that sounded light but landed like a stone. The corridor camera doesn't blink. Before Brielle could fully grasp what he meant, Walter tilted his head toward the dispatch building, where narrow walkways threaded between offices like veins, and added another pointed line that raised goosebumps on her skin. Old badges still scan if someone decides not to collect them. Sloane heard it, the corner of her mouth twitching like a hairline crack. Then she turned away quickly. But Brielle had already caught that moment, a tiny loss of control on the face of someone who always looked certain. Brielle tightened her grip on the papers, the panic sharpening into something more focused, as if last night's fear had been compressed and now finally found a direction to flow, and she understood that if this container stayed held, she'd be the first one thrown out. But if she proved the discrepancy wasn't accidental, she could keep not only her job, but her name, in a world that was always trying to erase the weak. She bent down, asked the security officer to let her photograph the actual seal number, asked for the most recent system update log, then spun back inside to demand a comparison against the original from storage, while behind her, Sloane still stood there, silent, beautiful, and dangerous. And Walter took a sip of cold coffee, his eyes following Brielle as if he'd just watched someone step toward a door that, once you walked through it, would never let you go back to the way things used to be. Brielle left the harbor after the sun had come up, but it still wasn't warm enough to drive off the cold clinging to the back of her neck. And even though she'd managed to cross-check the key numbers in time to keep the container from being held indefinitely, no feeling of victory arrived. Something else surfaced instead, heavy and dark, as if she'd accidentally tugged on a string without knowing who the other end was tied to. Walking past the rows of warehouses, she felt watched. Not the empty glance of a passerby, but a purposeful stare that tracked her step by step, making her tighten her grip on her bag strap and quicken her pace. And when she got into her car and shut the door, she still couldn't breathe right away, as if the air out there had been laced with something sharp that made her lungs afraid. She started the engine, drove out of the port district, tried to keep a normal speed, tried to steady herself with excuses, telling herself it was just lack of sleep, just last night's shock, just the shadow of that black SUV still pressing on her memory, But at the first intersection, when she checked the rearview mirror, she saw two cold white headlights hanging behind her like the eyes of an animal. The car wasn't close enough to draw attention, but it wasn't far enough to be called coincidence either. It held a measured distance, even and deliberate, following her through one turn, then another turn. Brielle swallowed hard, her palms slick as they slid on the steering wheel. She changed lanes and the car changed with her. She slowed down and it slowed too, and fear rose in her throat like the tide. She told herself maybe they were going the same way. Maybe it was just someone commuting. But her instincts didn't believe in kind explanations. The instincts of someone who'd lived too long under pressure believed only in signs. She turned onto a busier street where there were more cars and more people. And just as she was about to let her breath go, the car behind her disappeared, as if it had never existed at all, leaving only a smear of light across the wet road. Brielle checked the mirror again and saw nothing. But the feeling of being followed didn't leave. It only changed shape, from a shadow behind her into a shadow everywhere. In every pane of glass, in every pause between honks. Her phone buzzed right then. Not a call, just a message from an unknown number with no name. A single line with the biting sting of a thorn. Don't be curious. Don't take the meeting. Brielle felt her stomach seize. Her fingers went numb as she stared at the words on the screen, and one thought struck her mind like a stone thrown into deep water. What meeting? She hadn't told anyone. She hadn't said a word to anyone about the black car in the rain, about the note, about the feeling that someone had seen her, and yet this message read as if the sender were standing right behind her, knowing exactly which line she'd crossed. She wanted to reply, to ask who it was, to scream that she only wanted to live in peace, but her hands wouldn't move, because she understood that in games like this, her reaction was exactly what someone wanted, and she didn't know who she was talking to, or whether she was signing, once again, onto the edge of the blade. When she went back to work to submit the cross-check and ask for more original records, Brielle tried to keep her face normal, but Sloane caught the tension in her eyes the way a shark smells blood. Sloane didn't ask outright. She only smiled lightly, then slid more work onto Brielle's desk with a clean, practiced motion, saying that since Brielle had shown she was so capable out at the yard, she could surely handle a few more manifest packets that were backed up. And while they were at it, Sloane wanted a detailed explanation, complete, signed, stamped, so if anyone asked, they'd know exactly who was responsible. Every word Sloane spoke felt like another layer of netting tightening, and Brielle understood she was trying to scramble her, keep her busy, wear her down until she made a mistake, because all it would take was one small error and Sloane would have something to slap on the table and say, "See, I told you." Brielle kept her head down and worked, reading every line, checking every code. But sometimes, her eyes drifted on their own toward the glass door, the hallway, the camera corner, as if she were waiting for a dark shape to appear. She remembered what Walter had said. The corridor camera doesn't blink, and suddenly that line became both comfort and threat. Because if the camera didn't blink, it meant things had been recorded, and if things had been recorded, it meant someone was watching. The afternoon dragged by like a road with no exit. The rain had stopped, but the sky still felt heavy. And inside Brielle, it was as if there were water tapping, 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 reminding her that last night she'd left her name for someone who shouldn't have it. When it got dark, she left the office later than usual, partly because of the work Sloane had piled on, partly because she didn't want to step outside while it was still light and there were fewer people, but the later it got, the emptier the hallways became. And the sound of her shoes on the tile rang so clearly, it made her shiver. She got into her car, locked the doors, sat for a moment without starting it, looking around, trying to find those two white headlights in the mirror again, but the street was dark and quiet, lit only by dull yellow street lamps. Her phone buzzed as soon as her hand touched the key, the screen showing a call from a private number. Her heart jumped. She didn't want to answer, but part of her knew hiding was pointless, because whoever was calling already knew how to reach her in more ways than one. Brielle pressed the phone to her ear, her voice turning rough. "Hello." On the other end, there was silence. A long silence so deep, she could hear herself breathing, hear blood beating in her ears, hear even the distant sound of an engine like surf. Then a man's voice, low and calm, spoke her name like a statement, not a question. Brielle Hart. That was all. Nothing else. No explanation, no threat, no permission asked. And then the silence fell again, as if he were waiting to see where she would break, whether she would beg or harden. Brielle bit her lip until the taste of metal spread across her tongue, her throat dry and burning, and in that moment, she understood that the note under the windshield wiper the night before hadn't simply reached someone, it had opened a door, and on the other side of that door, someone was holding the rhythm of her heart in the palm of his hand. 8 o'clock that evening arrived like a stamp pressed onto Brielle's day. No reminder needed, because the strange silence after the call was enough to make time run as a cold straight line pulling her forward. She drove through streets brighter than the harbor district, and still she couldn't stop trembling, because the fear wasn't in the dark. It was in the fact that someone had spoken her name correctly, then gone quiet, as if he were listening to her heartbeat. She put on the most respectable coat she owned, fabric worn but still trying to hold its shape, and the whole way there she kept checking the rearview mirror, waiting for those 2 white headlights to return, waiting for a car to latch on behind her, waiting for a sign that she was driving into a trap. But the streets were so ordinary that it felt even more wrong. The address in the message led her to a clean row of buildings, where the sidewalks weren't cracked and the streetlights didn't flicker. The kind of place built to show that people here didn't live day to day on worry. There was no sign, no advertisement, only a thick glass door and a large man standing in front of it like a wall, expression blank, eyes scanning her from shoes to hair like a metal detector. Brielle swallowed hard, forced her voice steady as she said her name, and what chilled her wasn't his stare. It was the split second his stone face shifted, as if that name had been given to him in advance, as if she wasn't lost but expected. He opened the door without another question. No extra check, only a slight tilt of the head as a signal, and Brielle stepped inside, feeling as if she'd been cut loose from the city outside. The air in here was different, warm and dense, carrying the scent of scotch, leather, and a kind of expensive quiet that made people lower their voices without realizing. Amber light washed the walls, distant laughter sounded muffled as if wrapped in velvet, and yet every one of Brielle's steps seemed to thud inside her own chest. Someone guided her down a long corridor, past doors with no names, then stopped at a private room and opened it without knocking, as if the rule here wasn't courtesy, it was power. Inside, a man sat on a dark sofa, his posture loose, but the control coming off him made the whole room feel locked inside his hand. Gavin Rourke didn't stand. He only lifted his gaze, eyes dark and sharp, and Brielle had the sensation she'd stepped into the sightline of something that didn't miss its prey. On the low table in front of him, under the light, lay the object that dropped Brielle's heart straight to the bottom of her stomach. The note she'd wedged under the windshield wiper, crumpled, dried, still marked with water stains like an old wound, lay there like living proof, preserved carefully enough to look like a confession on display. Brielle stopped short, her breath caught high in her throat. She wanted to apologize, to explain, to ask why he had it, but her mouth was too dry to make a sound. Gavin set his glass down, the touch soft, yet it landed like a hammer, and he said in a low voice, calm in a way that was frightening, like someone used to commanding a room with a single sentence, "Sit down." Brielle perched on the edge of the chair across from him, hands braided tight to hide the shaking, eyes afraid to hold his too long, because every time she met his gaze, she felt as if thin layers of protection were being stripped away. Gavin didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she worked. It was as if all of that was already in his grasp. He looked at the note for a beat, then at her, and asked the one question Brielle had been asking herself since the rainy night. Why did you leave this? Brielle swallowed, her voice small but steady. Because it was my fault. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to become like them. A stretch of silence followed, and in it Brielle heard her own heart like a knock on something that couldn't be opened. Gavin watched her longer than people normally did, his gaze not softening, but something like cold curiosity passing through it. And then he said, "This morning at the port, a container was held because the manifest was wrong. They said the seal didn't match. They said one missing signature was enough to cut a contract." Brielle startled, because she hadn't told anyone about that beyond the yard and the office, and he went on, unhurried, not raising his voice. "You saw the discrepancy in the final character of the identification code before anyone could start shouting. You also saw that the seal number on the printout didn't match the yard handoff report, even though it was off by only one character." She blinked, scalp tingling, because those were details no one noticed unless they truly looked. And no one could know unless they were close enough to the system to see. Gavin lifted a file folder from beside him and placed it on the table in front of Brielle, then set down another one, identical in appearance. Same logo, Same title, same signature on the first page, and said, 2 sets of papers. One is correct, one is wrong. You have 3 breaths to tell me which one I should believe. Brielle stared at the 2 folders, feeling as if she'd been thrown into cold water. But the fear was no longer vague. It hardened into a sharp focus, the same focus she'd had standing in front of the held container. She flipped the first page, skimmed fast, then stopped at the appendix, her eye catching a small detail. In this copy, one shipping timeline line had been shifted just enough to make the handoff time overlap a prohibited window under regulations, an error big enough to turn a legal shipment into a question, big enough for someone to use as a noose. She placed her finger on the line, pushed the wrong folder aside, and said, "This one was altered. Not a typo. On purpose, because whoever did it wanted to create a dead point in the chain of custody." Gavin's expression didn't change, but the corner of his mouth moved, barely. Not a smile, more like a confirmation, as if he'd just heard what he'd been waiting to hear. He leaned forward, voice lower, a touch warmer but far more dangerous. "In this city, people lie to live, and they run when they're wrong. You left your name behind, and today you saw what others missed. I don't need your money, Brielle. I need something rarer." He paused, eyes locking on her like a door being shut. "I need someone who sees details and doesn't lie, even when telling the truth costs her everything." Brielle left the private room with the feeling she'd just stepped out of a different pressure zone, where the air was so dense that every breath had to ask permission. And even after the door closed behind her, Gavin's eyes still seemed stuck to her skin, cold and precise enough that she didn't dare let her shoulders drop. The escort brought her back to the lobby in silence. The bouncer opened the door for her like opening an exit, and when Brielle stepped onto the street, the night wind slapped her face hard enough to make her flinch, but what made her shake wasn't the wind. It was Gavin's words still echoing in her head, that he didn't need money. He needed someone who could see details and not lie. She drove home slower than usual, checking the mirrors again and again, afraid the tailing car would return. But the night was strangely quiet. Quiet in the way you'd be if you wanted her to hear her own thoughts clearly. The moment she set her keys on the table, her phone buzzed. A message from a private number appeared. No greeting, no explanation. Only an address, a time, and one short line. A 1-week trial, liaison. She read it several times, as if the words might vanish if she blinked, and then another message appeared right after. If you say no, I forget your name. If you say yes, you do your first job right now. Brielle's heart clenched, because the way he used the word forget sounded more frightening than threaten, as if he had the power to decide who existed in this city. She sank into a chair, both hands on her knees to stop them from shaking. And for a moment, she truly thought about turning off her phone, pulling a blanket over her head, and pretending none of it had happened, pretending the scratch didn't exist. The call didn't exist. The name Gavin Rourke didn't exist. But then she remembered the hospital debt notice, remembered the way Sloane looked at her like she was waiting for her to crumble, remembered Walter's line about old badges still scanning, and she understood that running was just a way to let other people keep writing her fate for her. She texted back a single, simple word. Yes. The reply came immediately, as if he'd been holding the phone and waiting. Good. A shipment is caught in paperwork. If it isn't fixed before the ship leaves, it will be held. And the one blamed will be an innocent dock worker. Brielle looked at the clock. It was late, but it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a test. She changed clothes, went back to her car, and drove to the address he'd sent. An auxiliary building in the port district, but not the place where she worked. A door with no nameplate, only a person waiting in the shadows like a marker post. The person didn't introduce himself, only handed her a temporary access badge and led her down a narrow hallway, past doors locked with key codes, into a small workroom with a computer, a printer, and a stack of files tied neatly with string, so clean it felt suspicious. On the desk sat a manifest packet, a set of bills of lading, and a note with only a few lines. Legal cargo. The file was dirtied. The ship leaves before dawn. Don't be wrong. Brielle stared at the pages, as if she were holding a fragile heart, as if squeezing even slightly would kill someone. And she wondered why a man like Gavin would care about an innocent dock worker, until she realized what he cared about wasn't the dock worker. It was the principle, that if someone could dirty a file whenever they wanted, tomorrow they could dirty his file too. She began to read, cross-checking each field. HS code, origin, destination, transshipment route, handoff times, signatures, and stamps. Her eyes moving fast but not reckless, because one wrong line could trigger an investigation. She found the oddity in the cargo description. One word swapped so the shipment now looked like it belonged to a category requiring additional inspection, dragging in a chain of permits that couldn't be completed in time. A perfect paperwork trap designed to make the ship leave the cargo behind. She checked the signatures and saw a digital signature attached close to midnight, not matching normal office hours for the records department. And when she traced the version history, she realized 2 manifests were being kept in parallel, one correct in the legacy system, one pushed into the new system right before the print order went out to the yard. Sweat gathered at the base of Brielle's neck, even though the room was cold, because she understood the person altering the file wasn't stupid. That person knew exactly where to insert the change, exactly where to shove the responsibility down onto someone with no protection. Brielle bit her lip, found the original in the electronic archive, compared line by line, then built a corrected version the proper way, not by secretly swapping it out, but by fixing it with a legal trail, with a reason, a cross-reference, and a chain confirmation, so when anyone asked, it would stand under any light. She printed a supplemental appendix, re-entered the correct description, drafted a short, clean explanation, then sent a confirmation request to the relevant department through the internal email template, even though she knew no one wanted to answer at this hour, because if she skipped that step, tomorrow they'd say she'd changed it on her own. She waited for a response through minutes that stretched like a pulled wire, and just as she started to worry she'd run out of time, a confirmation notice popped up, as if someone had been watching for the exact moment to nod. Brielle let out a breath, her chest aching like she'd been holding it too long. She closed the file, applied the new label, signed the notes section as the verifier, then carried the packet down to the yard as instructed, and placed it directly into the hands of the final responsible party, watching them stamp it and move it through the control checkpoint. Out there, the crane lights still burned, metal clanged and echoed, and in the distance the ship lay still like a massive animal waiting to wake. When Brielle returned to the small room, her phone buzzed again. Not a call, only a message from the private number, as short as a verdict. You did it. Tomorrow you'll do it again, but not where you're used to. Brielle stared at the screen, her heart still racing, and then the final line appeared, like a door swinging open with the click of a lock. Tomorrow you come to my port. The next morning, Brielle arrived on time, as if being even a minute late could be treated like false testimony, and she knew the instant her car turned into the dock complex that this was no longer her familiar workplace. The smell of engine oil was still there, the clang of metal, the containers stacked like walls, but the order here was different, clean in a way that felt frigid, quiet in a way that felt predatory. People moved without small talk, without laughter, every step purposeful, like a barracks. At the gate, guards in dark clothing wore earpieces tight to their heads, their eyes never leaving her car. And when Brielle presented the temporary badge and said her name, they didn't ask anything else. They only signaled for her to follow a separate route, not through the crowded dispatch area, but into a side corridor where cameras hung thick as eyes. A man guiding her spoke exactly 3 sentences, his voice flat as frozen water. No questions, no photos. Don't leave your position without authorization. Brielle nodded, feeling as if she were stepping into an invisible room where every word could be used as evidence. They took her up to an office level overlooking the docks, glass walls, but not the kind that felt open, more like a cage set high above so the people inside could see everything, while the people below never knew who was watching. Her workstation was already prepared, a computer, a thick file, and a new badge with no job title, only her name, as if here a person's name mattered more than a role, because a name was what could be erased if someone made a mistake. Brielle sat down, opened the file, tried to keep her breathing even, but her eyes kept drifting to each camera corner, remembering what Walter had said, the camera doesn't blink, and suddenly that sentence didn't feel like comfort anymore. It felt like a reminder that there was nowhere to hide if she slipped. She started working the way she had the day before, cross-checking manifests, verifying chain of custody, reviewing digital signatures, classifying risk. But every time she stood to grab a sheet of paper, the guide from earlier glanced at his watch as if every movement required a reason. Mid-morning, a door at the far end of the corridor opened. There was no announcement, no one calling a name, but the entire floor seemed to drop another degree in temperature, and Brielle knew he'd arrived before she even saw him, because the silence suddenly grew heavier, the way a forest holds its breath when a predator steps in. Gavin Rourke moved down the hallway in a dark coat, his pace neither fast nor slow. Yet everyone he passed automatically shifted aside, like water splitting before a ship's bow. He didn't look at Brielle for long. He stopped for the briefest beat at her desk, his gaze sliding across her screen like a scan of a report, then continued into the inner office. Not a greeting, not a question, and yet Brielle felt measured, and felt that whether she remained seated there depended on a few lines of numbers on her monitor. She barely had time to breathe out when she heard hurried footsteps behind her, then saw a young man being pulled down the corridor, face drained, mouth trying to form words. No one answered. Two men in dark clothing locking him between them the way you clamp a cargo crate. Brielle only caught the swing of his badge against his shirt, and cold sweat ran down her spine when she realized this wasn't the kind of walk to human resources. The looks on the people around her weren't curiosity. They were avoidance, the way people avoid looking at an accident. The young man was taken into a room with no glass, the door closing softly, almost carelessly, and there was no shouting, no pounding, only a long stretch of silence that made Brielle understand that discipline here didn't need noise. It needed the right person at the right moment, and the cost of crossing the unwritten rules might never be recorded on paper. She lowered her eyes to the file, hands slightly unsteady, forcing herself to focus on letters, on numbers, on the things she could control, because the things she couldn't were behind that door. She worked straight through to midday without realizing her stomach had been tightening with hunger, until her vision blurred just a little and her thoughts grew heavy as lead, and only then did she remember she hadn't eaten anything since morning. Shame rose in her when she thought she should stand up and go find food, but the rules had said don't leave your position without authorization, and she didn't know where without authorization began. She kept working, correcting each line, matching each stamp, but the text started to ripple before her eyes like waves. A shadow fell across her desk, not from a lamp, from a person, and when Brielle looked up, Gavin was standing there, and she couldn't tell how long he'd been there. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He didn't ask if she was tired. He only set a box of hot food on her desk, steam still rising, and a thin envelope, then looked at her screen for one more beat. Brielle started to say she didn't need it, started to refuse because she was afraid of owing anything, but Gavin had already turned away, as if the act were simply part of the order of things, not a favor. She stared at the food, the warmth and smell rising until her eyes stung, not from sentimental tears, but because for the first time, in a long time, someone had noticed her exhaustion and hadn't turned it into a joke. The envelope was unmarked, but when she touched it, she guessed it was an advance, a way to keep hospital debt from crushing her throat before she'd had a chance to prove she deserved to stand. She ate quickly, but not greedily, working as she ate, as if she was afraid that if she stopped too long, everything would be taken back. And right then, the slow, familiar sound of footsteps came from the outer corridor. Brielle turned her head and saw Walter Briggs pass by the glass, still holding his cup of cold coffee, his eyes cutting inside as if checking something he'd already predicted. He didn't stop for long. He only tapped the doorframe once, very lightly, and said just loud enough for Brielle to hear, "I told you the camera doesn't blink." The words landed inside her like the final piece of a puzzle, because now she understood Walter hadn't said it only to scare her. He'd said it to warn her that in Gavin's world, everything had evidence, and if she wanted to survive, she would have to learn to walk straight-backed under hundreds of eyes without leaving a single stain, even when someone else deliberately tried to throw mud at her. The second day in Gavin's port began with an unusual quiet, not the quiet of no work, but the quiet of people waiting for something to drop, and Brielle felt it the moment she set her bag on the desk, powered up, and saw her internal inbox already filled with a new chain of emails. The subject line cold, compliance procedure update, requiring file reviews under a new standard, with resubmission due before end of day. She skimmed, frowning, because the request included rechecking manifests for shipments that had been finalized the day before, and if those were reopened now, any tiny discrepancy could be inflated into a system failure. Before she could think it through, the glass corridor door opened and a group stepped in like a draft of winter air. Among them was Sloane Mercer, who, as Brielle quickly learned, had been strategically transferred to Gavin's inner circle as part of a new compliance oversight. It was a move that felt less like a promotion and more like a deliberate infiltration. She stood there, a new name badge gleaming and her posture confident, as if she was returning to the place she belonged. Brielle felt her blood turn cold in a single beat, because Sloane wasn't just here. She was here with the kind of authority that made people step aside and comply. She smiled at a few people, the smile just polite enough to be unchallenged, then stopped at Brielle's desk, glanced at yesterday's food box now cleared away, glanced at the advance envelope now put away, and said in a voice light as air but sharp as paper, "I heard you work very hard, Brielle. But here, hard isn't enough. It has to be right, and right is confirmed by me." Brielle started to say she was only following instructions, but Sloane set a new file packet on her desk, clipped with a printed note. "Needs updating to the new version, due before this afternoon, and remember to send me the digital copy for archiving, because if one appendix is missing, the person responsible will be the one who handled it directly." "Understood." The last words felt like fingertips brushing her throat, not a question, but a suffocating snare. Brielle nodded, because in a world like this, the smartest reaction wasn't arguing, it was watching. She began working the way she'd learned to, scanning each line, matching each stamp, checking each handoff marker, forcing her mind to stay calm. But only an hour later, when she was ready to send the digital file to Sloane, the system threw an error, version mismatch, and when Brielle reopened the folder, she saw the risk appendix she'd just finished had vanished as if it had never existed. She checked the history and found a different version in its place. Same file name, same date and time, but missing exactly one crucial page. The page with the signature confirming the chain of custody. Brielle felt as if someone had reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the one thing keeping her upright. And she knew immediately this wasn't random. This was how you killed someone with paperwork, without touching skin, just making one thing disappear at the exact moment, then standing beside her and asking why she'd been careless. She rushed to the print room to grab the paper backup, but when she opened the storage drawer, the folders were disturbed as if someone had just rummaged through them, and the marked hard copy she'd clipped was gone too, leaving only a few meaningless sheets skewed in place like a taunt. She returned to her desk, heart racing, face held steady, because panic was a gift she couldn't afford to hand Sloane. She started rebuilding the appendix from the original, pulling from the archive, matching timestamps, following the edit chain, and the deeper she traced, the more she saw the sabotage had been done cleanly, professionally, by someone who understood the system well enough to create an error another person would have to carry. Just as Brielle was about to finish the rebuilt version, a new email flashed in her inbox. From compliance. The deadline moved up. Submission required within 1 hour. Brielle checked the time and felt as if a hand had tightened around her throat, because that deadline couldn't be procedure. It was a trap. A trap to make sure she couldn't finish, to give Sloane a reason to say she wasn't capable. She clenched her teeth and worked faster. But the faster she moved, the more careful she had to be. Because one small mistake here wasn't only losing a job. It could become the reason the door to that windowless room opened again. And this time, the name on the badge would be hers. While sending the rebuilt file to the printer, Brielle passed the inner corridor where the compliance office sat close to Gavin's office, like a warning that everything had eyes, and she accidentally caught a voice leaking through a half-open door. Sloane's, no longer soft, no longer polite, but tight and urgent like someone pinned against a wall. Brielle wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She only stopped because the words pricked her ear like a needle. "I've done it. I'm doing it. But don't touch my brother." Inside, there was another man's voice, low and indistinct, as if filtered through a phone, only fragments audible, enough to know it was an order, not a conversation. Sloane spoke again, her voice rough. "I'm telling you again. Don't touch my brother. I'll deliver what you want, but I need him alive." Brielle stood frozen for a beat, because in that instant, Sloane's picture cracked open, not to reveal pathetic weakness, but to reveal a wire tightening around her throat, something that could make even an arrogant woman beg. Brielle backed away as lightly as she could, heart pounding, and the moment she turned, her phone on the desk buzzed with a new email alert, a subject line that appeared for a blink and vanished like a ghost. Mallory allocation. Brielle blinked, thinking she'd misread it, but the trace stayed burned into her memory like scorched ink. And when she opened her inbox, the email wasn't there, as if it had never arrived. She looked up and saw Sloane standing at the far end of the hall, eyes fixed on her without blinking, and Brielle couldn't tell whether Sloane had seen her pause at that door, had seen her gaze linger a second too long. But she knew one thing for certain. This fight wasn't only about who bullied whom anymore. It was about a name hiding inside the system like a splinter of ice, and someone was using Sloane as the hand to drive it home. Brielle sent the rebuilt appendix at the last possible minute, her hands still trembling inside her palms. And when the sent confirmation appeared, she felt no relief, only a cold current running through her spine, because she understood she'd survived a small trap. But the person setting them had already started changing the game, and next time they wouldn't only make a page disappear. That morning, the port seemed louder than usual, but the noise wasn't people talking. It was machines howling, warning sirens screaming in long, high lines, metal slamming into metal with a harsh crack like teeth grinding, and Brielle felt something was wrong the moment she stepped into the glass level overlooking the yard, because an entire cluster of workers had gathered at the eastern container zone, where normally forklifts moved with clockwork steadiness. An internal message popped up on her screen. Hazardous cargo held in Zone 4. Verify seal and chain of custody immediately. And that one short line was enough to chill her skin, because hazardous cargo here wasn't a paperwork joke. It could be chemicals, industrial batteries, flammables, anything that, handled wrong, turned a port into a massive trap. Brielle stood, asked permission from the upper-level supervisor, then moved quickly down into the yard, through the corridor dense with cameras, her footsteps ringing on steel so loudly in her ears they sounded like her heartbeat, and the closer she got, the sharper the bite of something in the wind became. Not strong enough to choke, but strong enough to prove this wasn't just a line in a manifest. Zone 4 appeared like a scene with the music cut out. A gray container stood by itself, doors locked, the seal unnaturally new and bright. A forklift frozen mid-lane. Its front wheels slipped across an oily streak that hadn't yet been sanded, and a dock worker sat slumped against a post, one hand clutching his wrist. Face pale, still forcing a thin smile to reassure his coworkers that he was fine. The foreman spoke fast, as if counting. They'd received the order to lift this container on schedule, but the higher it went, the more the forklift rocked, as if the weight inside didn't match the description. Then the wheel slipped on the wet surface and it nearly tipped, and if they hadn't lowered the forks in time, the container would have shifted, and one more second could have left someone crushed. Brielle looked at the oil sheen, the skid marks, the worker's wrist swelling red, then at the seal on the container doors, and a cold wave ran up her spine, because she understood an accident like this wasn't only damp weather. It started with a wrong decision somewhere in the custody chain, a decision that turned a metal box that seemed mindless into something that could bite. She crouched to read the seal number, then opened the manifest on the foreman's tablet and cross-checked right there, and her heart slipped a beat when she saw the number on the seal didn't match the number in the system. Not off by one character like the delicate tricks from before, but a completely different number, as if someone had removed the old seal, put on a new one, then pushed a false update at the last minute, so that when the crew lifted the load, they believed they were handling something cleared, when in fact, they were lifting a monster. A port security officer arrived, looked at her, and said they'd had to file a workplace incident report, that the shipment would be locked down until verification, and that if there were signs the seal had been tampered with, a report would be sent up to the relevant authorities. When the words relevant authorities were spoken, a few faces nearby changed, and a whisper drifted through the wind like smoke. Federal. Brielle felt her throat go raw and dry, because she knew how heavy those words were in Gavin's world, where everything lived on order and control, and one well-timed inspection could flip the whole system the way you flip a rug. She looked back toward the building and saw silhouettes standing behind the glass on the upper level, and among them was one dark shape set apart. No wasted movement, as if the entire port was a chessboard, and he was counting the moves. Gavin didn't have to stand in front of her for her to know he was there, because the tension in the yard had adjusted itself to his rhythm. Everyone speaking softer, everyone walking slower. Sloane appeared after that like someone arriving to put out a fire, coat pristine, compliance badge bright, a thin folder in her hands as if everything could be solved with paper, and she asked at once, her voice just loud enough for the right people to hear, who handled the chain of custody paperwork for this lot. Brielle didn't even have time to answer before Sloane's eyes slid to her, a thin smile, and then she turned to the foreman and said that under the new assignment, Brielle was the one cross-checking the risk appendix, and she may have missed the seal update if a last-minute change had been made. It wasn't a direct accusation, not quite. It was a suggestion placed carefully, bait dropped so people could draw their own conclusions, and in offices and in the shadows, People always preferred their own conclusion over the truth. Brielle felt heat rush to her face. Not from shame, but from anger and fear at once, because she knew Sloane was doing what she did best, building a story that sounded reasonable enough for everyone to nod, so that if there was an investigation later, Brielle's name would sit on the first line of the memo. She drew a deep breath and said clearly that she had cross-checked only what the system version provided, that a physical seal change couldn't be done by her, and that if there'd been a last-minute update, they needed to pull the change history and the access logs. But Sloane only shrugged as if Brielle were making excuses, then said lightly, "We'll review it, but right now we need a written explanation to send up to management." The word explanation sounded like a new collar being fitted. Before Brielle could regroup, someone from the port executive team arrived, face tight, saying the shipping partner had been notified. They demanded an explanation the same day, and because there was an injury, the file would be classified for strict review, with a strong possibility that regulatory authorities would request to see the control chain. The rumor about federal attention wasn't a whisper anymore. It turned into a current of electricity across the yard, making workers who'd been talking suddenly fall silent. Brielle looked at the dock worker holding his wrist, saw his eyes trying to stay calm but carrying something lost, and she hated, bitterly, that a dirty paper game had spilled into the bones and flesh of an innocent man. When she returned upstairs with the incident report in hand, the dry lines about time, location, injury level, and suspected seal tampering pinning into her like needles, she saw Gavin standing in the corridor, not inside an office, standing out where the cameras could see him most clearly, like a declaration that he didn't fear being watched, and also that he wouldn't give anyone the chance to say he'd hidden. He took the report from an assistant's hand, flipped exactly one page, then raised his eyes to Sloane, to Brielle, and finally straight out to the yard, where the gray container still sat under lockdown. Gavin didn't raise his voice, but when he asked who had approved the seal change, the entire floor seemed to freeze, because that question wasn't only about a number, it was about who dared touch his boundary. Sloane held her composure, but Brielle could see her hand clench hard around the folder edge, and inside Brielle, one thing locked into place like a nail driven deep. This was only the first scare, a warning written in injury, and whoever had done this didn't only want to dirty paper. They wanted to prove they could make the port bleed. The meeting was called so urgently that the whole glass level felt stretched tight, everyone moving faster but speaking less. And when Brielle stepped into the conference room, she felt air that was cold as freshly polished metal, so clean that even the sound of swallowing carried. A stack of files was already laid out on the long table: the workplace incident report, photos of the new seal, a printout of the system update history. And at the head of the table, Gavin sat like a dark stone, needing no gavel to silence people, because his authority didn't come from a title. It came from the fact that everyone understood he could decide the fate of each person in that room. Sloane sat slightly to the right, posture straight, face composed, as if she were the only one truly concerned with procedure, and everyone else was just noise. Brielle sat across, hands pressed close together under the table to hide their shaking, her mind still holding the oily streak and the dock worker's swollen red wrist, and inside her was a sharp ache made of anger and fear, because someone had used another person's body to send a message. Gavin opened the report and turned the pages slowly, and that slowness was more frightening than shouting, because it felt as if he was weighing every word to decide who it would land on. When he lifted his eyes, his question didn't circle. Who is responsible for controlling the risk appendix for the Zone 4 shipment? Sloane didn't hesitate. She tilted her head a fraction, her voice smooth as if rehearsed in a mirror. Under the updated compliance assignment, Brielle is the verifier for the risk appendix and the final chain of custody confirmation before the file is issued to the yard. If the appendix is missing or the seal change isn't updated, then the failure is at the final verification step. Sloane's words fell onto the table like a thin knife, not cutting immediately, but sharp enough that people turned toward Brielle with eyes that carried pity and judgment at once, the familiar look of a system that always wants one person to blame quickly. Brielle's throat burned dry, but she didn't lower her head, because she understood that if she bowed, the story would be written for her, and no one would correct it. Gavin looked at Brielle, his gaze showing no obvious emotion, only a frightening focus, as if he wasn't listening for excuses. He was listening for truth in the way she breathed. Brielle spoke slowly, forcing her voice not to shake. I didn't approve any physical seal change, and I verified only against the system version I was given at the time I worked. I saw discrepancies, and I reported abnormalities in the chain. But the risk appendix for this lot wasn't created by me, and I didn't receive any notice of changes before the shipment was sent to the yard. Sloane's mouth tightened. She lifted the file in front of her, flipped a few pages like someone proving something obvious, then said in a voice pitched for the whole room, "Then how do you explain that the risk appendix isn't in the issued file packet? If you did the final verification, you had to see it was missing." That question struck the most dangerous point, because it didn't demand that Brielle prove who did it. It demanded that she admit carelessness, and in this world, carelessness could be treated like guilt. Brielle swallowed hard. She wanted to say the appendix had been made to disappear. She wanted to point straight at Sloane. She wanted to describe the swapped versions, the moved deadlines, the renamed files. But she knew if she threw accusations without proof, she would only become the panicked woman clawing for a ledge. She looked down at the packet, at the gap where the appendix should have been, and in her head she heard Walter's line. "The camera doesn't blink," as a reminder that truth existed. She just didn't have it in her hands yet. Brielle lifted her gaze and said the one thing that could stand under any light. "I didn't place the risk appendix into that packet, and I didn't delete it from the system. But I'll admit one thing. I reviewed the issued packet, and I failed to catch that the appendix was missing at the last moment. I focused on the seal discrepancy and the chain of custody, and I should have done one final full sweep before it went to the yard. So I accept responsibility for not detecting the final omission, even though I'm not the one who created it." The room went still for a strange beat, not because they believed her immediately, but because her answer didn't sound like someone cornered. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She didn't dump everything on someone else to save herself. She placed her part of the fault on the table like a stone. Heavy, but real. Sloane leaned forward slightly as if she wanted to smile, but Gavin's eyes shifted to her, and that shift alone was enough to erase the smile before it formed. Gavin leaned back, fingers laced, voice low and even. "I've met a lot of people who lie so well it sounds like truth. And I've met very few people who will claim their part when they don't have to." He looked straight at Brielle, his eyes sharp as a blade but no longer as cold as before, something like an assessment in them, as if he'd found a point of support in the mud. Then Gavin turned to the table and tapped once, not hard, but like the click of a lock. "Audit all system access and all file edit permissions for the past 3 days, including versions, change history, and print permissions. Also, collect every old keycard that hasn't been deactivated, immediately. Anyone holding a card they're not authorized to have will be dealt with." Sloane sat even straighter, her face unchanged, but Brielle saw a small pulse jump at her temple, the reflex of someone who'd just been touched in the one place that hurt. Gavin didn't pause. He looked to the head of security. "I want the list of old cards, the list of doors opened, the times they were opened, and the corridor camera. If the camera has it, I want it." The words made Brielle feel cold again, because corridor camera sounded like Walter's warning pulled straight into the room, as if the old guard's reminder had just become an official order. As Gavin stood, the meeting ended as fast as a clean cut. And when Brielle stepped into the hallway, she saw Walter briefly at the far end, standing under a camera eye blinking red. He didn't come closer. He only looked at her a moment longer than usual, then lifted his cup of cold coffee in a wordless greeting, as if to remind her that here everything was seen, and if Brielle wanted to survive among paper blades, she would have to learn to walk so that the truth followed behind her like a shadow, never cut away. The audit order had been out for less than half a day when the second strike landed, fast and deep enough to make the port feel like someone had grabbed it by the throat and tipped it upside down, because this was no longer a single container that could be sealed off and explained away. This was a major shipment tied to the contract Gavin used to keep the whole system standing upright. That afternoon, the dispatch room screens suddenly lit up red with alerts. Seal chains not matching on the main outbound line, multiple containers on the same voyage flagged for seal changes without approval, and when Brielle ran down into the yard with the control team, she saw a long row of containers already staged for loading on schedule. But the seal numbers on a critical cluster didn't match the system. Not off by one character. Changed outright, as if someone had replaced an entire set of seals with a new batch. Clean, uniform, and forged to perfection. The foreman looked drained of color and said the shipping partner had just called. Their risk department had issued an alert that if the custody chain wasn't clean, they would halt the contract immediately and demand an independent investigation, because they couldn't allow their name to be attached to a port showing signs of mass seal tampering. Brielle heard it and her ears rang, because she knew an independent investigation, in those companies' language, meant inviting authorities to get involved, and once those authorities set foot in the port, they wouldn't look only at this one shipment. They would look at everything. A message from the partner hit Gavin's inbox directly, and was forwarded to Brielle with a line cold enough to cut. You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to prove this is internal sabotage that has been contained, or we will terminate the contract and request a search under procedure. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning flared in Brielle's mind like a bright countdown clock, because it wasn't just a paperwork deadline. It was the deadline before trained dogs were unleashed into the port. It was the deadline before Gavin was dragged out as the sacrificial offering in a crisis he wasn't allowed to appear weak in. She looked around and saw workers pause mid-task, saw anxious eyes, heard a few people whisper federal as if naming a storm, and up on the glass-level silhouettes clustered like black birds before wind. Gavin appeared in the yard corridor like a vertical line drawn straight. He didn't shout, he didn't panic, but the way he looked at the row of containers with altered seals made the whole space tighten, because that gaze said one thing clearly: someone is testing whether I bleed. He took a call, spoke a few short sentences in a low voice like stone rolling, then ended it, turned to security and ordered every entry and exit to this yard locked, the scene preserved, no one touching a single seal, until everything was filmed and cross-checked. Sloane stood behind him with a folder pressed to her chest, her face tense but still trying to hold steady, and Brielle saw her glance at Brielle in a flash, and that look wasn't only contempt anymore. It carried a thin thread of fear of being exposed. When Gavin turned to Brielle, he didn't ask if she was scared. He gave her one sentence: the way you set a load on someone's shoulders. Tonight you finish the deal-saving packet, the full transfer contract, the risk appendices, the chain of custody, the seal control report. I need it clean as an operating room before morning. Brielle felt her throat tighten, because she knew that packet wasn't only thick. It was sensitive. It held numbers and shipping routes that, in the wrong hands, became disaster. And now it had to be finished in a single night while the port was under attack, while every eye was on her waiting for her to slip. But she nodded, because she had no choice. And deeper than that, she didn't want to watch an innocent person pay again for someone else's dirty game. She returned to her workstation on the glass level after dark, port lights blazing like a second city, the machinery still running out there but sounding heavier, as if the whole system was breathing too fast. Brielle opened file after file, checked page after page, rebuilt the custody chain from the originals, flagged altered points, requested access logs, requested photos of the physical seals, and assembled them into a report that could stand up under any search. She had to work like someone running while patching the road beneath her, dodging traps while building a clean lane for a convoy to pass through before the gate slammed shut. Every time she saved a section, she remembered the files that had vanished before, remembered how an appendix could be pulled out like yanking a support beam from under a house, and that fear made her more careful, made her create backups, made her keep the legal trail intact. Her phone buzzed nonstop with updates, the partner demanding confirmation, security demanding signatures, legal asking for progress, and each time she checked the clock, the minute hand seemed to run faster than normal, pulling 9 o'clock tomorrow morning closer, like a vehicle rushing straight at her. Out in the corridor, people moved constantly, hurried footsteps, doors opening and closing, and somewhere deeper inside, Gavin's voice cut through, short and sharp, ordering cross-checks, card collection, access locks, building a wall in the night. Brielle stared at lines of text until her eyes stung and her head swam from lack of sleep, but she didn't dare leave her chair, because she understood that if she stopped, the clock would keep moving, and if 9 o'clock arrived without proof that this was contained internal sabotage, the port would be searched, the contract would be cut, Gavin would be hauled out like a guilty man, and she would be crushed beneath her own name all over again. The night moved like a tunnel with no windows, only the glare of the screen beating against Brielle's eyes and the metal noise from the docks rising in steady pulses like a clock tapping her temples, reminding her that 9 o'clock in the morning was getting closer without mercy. She had finished building the seal control report, attached every photo, access log, custody chain, and risk appendix, every page tagged, every change carrying a clean legal trail, so spotless she believed that if anyone inspected it, they'd see only the truth. When the computer clock rolled past one of those cold, late-night hours, Brielle let out a shaky breath, her finger hovering over the final save key like a hand on a deadbolt, and then she pressed it. The screen blinked once, then went dark for a beat that made her heart drop straight through her body. A second later, the display flared back in a deep red, the color of dried blood, and in the center a white alert box appeared. Access denied, file corrupted, user Brielle Hart, data deletion action recorded. Brielle went still, her eyes widened. Her hand stayed on the keyboard, but she couldn't feel the keys, as if her body had been separated from reality. She clicked again and again, tried reopening the folder, tried pulling a backup, tried logging out and back in, but everything was locked, a thick lock like poured concrete, and the worst part was the log line under her name, cold characters stating that she had deleted, she had destroyed, she had erased the very things she'd traded her breath all night to protect. Cold sweat spread at the base of her neck. Her throat tightened. For a few seconds she heard only the pounding of blood in her ears like surf hitting rock. No, she breathed, not for anyone to hear, but because if she didn't say it, the red on the screen would become truth. She shot to her feet, the chair screeching across the floor, and ran to the printer to check the hard copies she'd already printed. But the paper tray was empty, as if someone had cleared it. She tore through the folder she'd clipped together, and found only the cover shifted sideways, the critical pages gone, and panic flared like fire meeting wind. She spun back to the monitor, eyes locked on the words user Brielle Hart, feeling as if someone had stamped betrayal across her forehead, and she understood immediately that whoever did this didn't just want her fired. They wanted her dead in Gavin's eyes before 9 o'clock ever arrived. They wanted her to become the perfect reason for the partner to believe this port was rotten at the root. At the far end of the corridor, Gavin's door opened, and the light from his office spilled out in a sharp strip, and Gavin stepped into view like a dense shadow, not running, yet still turning the air on the glass level into ice. He walked straight to Brielle's desk, looked at the red screen for a beat, then looked at her, his expression not exploding into rage, but settling into a steel-cold silence, the kind of silence that appears when someone is used to betrayal and is measuring how deep the blade went this time. Brielle felt her heart clamp. She tried to speak, her voice breaking. I didn't delete anything. I only hit save. I built the whole packet. I have logs. I have photos. But her words died when Gavin lifted a hand, a small motion that still cut her off like a wall. He turned slightly and said one short word, his voice not loud but sharp enough to make skin crawl. Take her down. 2 security men stepped in, not rough, but certain, like they were handling evidence. Brielle backed up on instinct, but there was nowhere to go. She was bracketed on both sides and escorted down the corridor beneath cameras blinking red, past coded doors, into a private elevator with no mirror, where the white light made skin look sickly. She heard the elevator doors close like a coffin lid, and in that moment she understood the clock was still running. 9 o'clock was still coming, and if she was locked down here, she would have no chance to save her name. The holding room on the lower level wasn't a movie jail. It was clean and cold. A metal table, a hard chair, a camera mounted in the ceiling corner, a fluorescent light that didn't give anyone a shadow to hide in. Someone took Brielle's phone and placed it in a tray, stripping away the one thing she could have used to call anyone or prove anything. And the door shut, the lock clicking softly but final. Minutes later, Gavin walked in alone. No bodyguards, no assistant. Only him, and the silence that followed him like a coat. He sat across from Brielle and set a stack of paper on the table. A printed system log, cold lines placing her name beside a deletion action like a sentence prepared in advance. He didn't snarl. He didn't slam the table. That was what made it terrifying. Because when a man like Gavin didn't need to raise his voice, it meant he'd already decided truth came in only 2 colors. He looked at Brielle for a long time, long enough that she felt examined down to the bone, and then he asked one question, his voice low and clear, sharp as a paper cut. Did you do it? Brielle didn't cry. She didn't beg, because she knew begging only made people see weakness, and truth didn't require volume. She met Gavin's eyes, even as her heart hammered like it wanted out of her chest, and she said one single word, steady, no. Outside that cold room, somewhere in the building, the clock kept moving toward 9 o'clock in the morning, and Brielle felt every minute pass like a finger tightening around her throat, but she didn't lower her head, because if she bowed, the name on the log would win, and if she stayed upright, even locked away, she still had one chance for the truth to find its way back up into daylight. The holding room door opened after Brielle's answer, not with a bang or a burst of fury, but with a silence even colder. Gavin rose as if he'd recorded what needed recording, his eyes not softening, but not slamming shut either, like a man who hadn't sentenced her and hadn't pardoned her. Brielle was pulled into the basement corridor with empty hands, her phone already taken. Everything she could have used to defend herself reduced to her voice, and a truth she couldn't prove. They brought her up to the lower lobby, where white light made every face look sharp and tired, then stopped at the exit, as if preparing to throw her out and cut the problem loose. A quick, clean sweep before dawn and before 9 o'clock arrived. Brielle looked through the glass and saw the city still dark. The rain stopped, but the sidewalks still slick with water, and in that moment her greatest fear wasn't being fired. It was being fired under the saboteur's name they'd pinned to her, so that tomorrow morning, when the search began, every record would say user Brielle Hart deleted, and she would vanish from the story as a true culprit. The security man beside her asked flatly if she had anything she wanted to say, like a final ritual before closing the file, and Brielle opened her mouth but didn't know where to begin when everything had been locked. Every piece of proof taken, every doorway watched by cameras she had no right to view. Right then, slow footsteps sounded from the corridor leading toward the main lobby, unhurried, unpressed, a different rhythm among people sprinting after a clock. Walter Briggs appeared. Old coat, the familiar cup of cold coffee, shoulders slightly rounded but his stride steady, like a man who knew exactly where he stood and why. He looked at Brielle for a beat, then at the security man as if staring straight at the process itself, and then he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small folded slip of paper, and set it on the stone counter by the door like placing a card on the table. "Keep her here." The security man frowned, but Walter didn't argue. He only tapped the slip once, and spoke in the same rough, slow voice he'd used at the port. The corridor camera doesn't blink. Brielle stared at the paper and saw a string of times written clearly, exact hour and minute paired with a door code, and one short note carved like a scratch, physical access to the server room. Her heart hit so hard it hurt, because her mind connected it instantly. The red screen didn't appear by itself. It required a hand inside the system, and that hand could have gone through this exact door at this exact time. Walter looked straight at Brielle, his eyes not tender, only stern like an old man's warning after seeing too much injustice. Old badges still scan if someone decides not to collect them. "I saw someone use an old card to enter the server area tonight. Not you." Brielle's throat tightened, not from emotion, but because for the first time she had something concrete, something that could be placed on a table, something that could be checked, something that could crack the false log crushing her name. The security man started to say procedure wouldn't allow it, but Walter only tilted his head toward the ceiling cameras, as if reminding him that procedure had eyes too. And then he said the deciding line, his voice not loud, but heavy as an iron door. "If she walks out, she's admitting guilt." The words drove straight into Brielle and made her look back at the glass exit like it was a pit. Because yes, if she walked out now, the file would be left with one simple conclusion. The culprit was removed, the issue was handled, and her name would be used to seal the lid. Brielle took a deep breath, fear rising like cold water and then pulling back, replaced by something harder and sharper. The same feeling from the rainy night when she'd tucked her note under the wiper. Not because she enjoyed being good, but because she couldn't bear living like a coward. She turned to the security man and said clearly, "I'm not leaving. I want to see Mr. Gavin." The guard hesitated, but Walter's stare didn't move. And finally an internal door opened, and they brought Brielle back to the elevator, up to the glass level where she'd worked until the red screen swallowed everything. The corridor was still bright, still cold, footsteps echoing like taps on time, and Brielle knew each minute was sliding toward 9 o'clock like a saw blade. Gavin was in the operations room speaking with legal and security, his voice low but final, and when he saw Brielle, he stopped, his eyes sharp with the question of why she hadn't disappeared from the problem. Brielle walked straight up, set the timestamp slip on the table in front of him, her hands still shaking but her back straight, and said, "I need 5 minutes. Let me cross-check the physical door log for the server area against this timestamp and the corridor camera." Someone accessed the system using an old card before the red screen appeared. "If you throw me out, you'll throw out the wrong person and let the saboteur win before 9 o'clock. The room fell silent, with only the hum of the air conditioning and the imaginary clock in Brielle's head. Gavin looked at the slip, then at Walter standing in the doorway like a witness who wouldn't bow. then at Brielle. And in his eyes she saw what he always kept hidden. Not mercy, but the need to know the truth before he gave an order. He didn't nod right away, but he didn't brush it aside either. And that was enough for Brielle to know she'd won a narrow crack of space. A crack that would slam shut with a lock's click at 9 o'clock if she didn't force her way through it now. The 5 minutes Gavin gave Brielle weren't 5 minutes of pity. They were 5 minutes from a man standing on the edge, deciding where the blood should fall. And Brielle understood that if she didn't produce something sharp as a blade, she would be cut out of the story immediately. The tech team was dragged in within a few breaths, their hands flying over the keyboard like they were defusing a bomb, while Brielle stood close to the monitor, eyes unblinking, tracking every line of physical access logs pulled from the door control system, and every frame of corridor camera footage brought up. Walter's timestamp appeared clearly, a specific moment before the red screen swallowed the data, and when the technician entered the server area door code, the access list came up like a red thread. There was one door opening at that exact time, outside the normal permissions for the night shift, and most importantly, it was executed using an old card that should have been deactivated after the earlier collection. Gavin stood behind them, not speaking, but Brielle could feel his weight pressing on everyone's shoulders like a vice, forcing the truth to surface faster. The technician zoomed in on the camera frame. The corridor was bright white. A figure moved through, slim build, dark coat, hair tied back neat, walking quickly, and with the easy certainty of someone who'd traveled that route many times. Brielle couldn't see the face clearly, but she recognized the posture at once, the way the shoulders were held, the way the head tilted to check the camera, and cold ran up her spine as the image matched only one person. The technician pulled the badge ID, and the words appeared under the harsh light like a sentence: Sloan Mercer. No one breathed for several seconds, as if the room had dropped into a vacuum. Then someone let out a soft curse, and Brielle felt her mind flare bright and heavy at the same time, because this was no longer instinct. It was evidence, something that could be put in front of the partner before 9 o'clock, something that could save the deal, save the port, save her name from being nailed down. Gavin didn't explode with rage. He simply turned and issued one short order, his voice like steel dragged over stone. Bring Sloan here, now. The security team vanished from the room like shadows, and while they waited, Brielle watched the clock in the corner of the screen, each minute burning away. 9 o'clock no longer far, and even with the ID in hand, they still needed a larger truth. They needed to know who stood behind it, who paid, who pulled the strings, because otherwise they would only catch a pawn while the other side's king stayed outside laughing. Sloan was brought into the operations room quickly, her face still trying to hold calm, her eyes cold, her chin lifted slightly as if she'd been summoned only to correct procedure. But when Gavin placed the printed physical log and the camera frame in front of her, that confidence cracked in a single, uncontrolled beat, like ice splitting. Gavin asked directly, no detour. You used an old card to enter the server area tonight. What were you doing in there? Sloan gave a thin smile and forced her voice steady. I don't know what you're talking about. I've been in the compliance office all night. I've been handling this crisis for you. Brielle felt heat rise in her blood, but she didn't interrupt, because this was Gavin's ground, and she knew when he asked in that voice, he wasn't asking to hear a story. Gavin tapped the printout once, only once, but it made Sloan's eyes flick. This is the door log. This is the camera. This is your badge ID. If you want to keep lying, you're choosing the way you die. The last line wasn't loud. It was simply the stripped-down truth of this world, and Brielle watched Sloan's lips go pale. Sloan looked around as if searching for a way out, but every direction carried a red blinking camera eye, and then the mask fell, not with tears, but with a broken gasp, like someone who'd been choked for too long. She blurted the sentence Brielle had overheard before, her voice cracking. Don't touch my brother. Don't touch him anymore. The room went dead silent, and Gavin didn't move. He asked again, Who is touching your brother? Sloan clenched her hands so hard her nails dug into her palms until they whitened. Then she said it like spitting blood. Cyrus Mallory. He has that thing. He has proof from the old seal change case, the one I was forced to sign to cover for someone else. He said if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd throw it out, and my brother would disappear. Brielle felt her stomach turn to ice, because the name Mallory was the shadow that had flashed across her inbox like a ghost, and now it had shape, teeth, and a voice. Gavin still didn't show emotion, but his eyes darkened. You broke my system for a threat. Sloane shook her head hard. I didn't want to. I thought I could adjust it just enough so you wouldn't fall, so the partner would only panic a little, so he'd be satisfied and let my brother go. I didn't know he'd hit that hard. I didn't know someone would get hurt. I didn't know he'd push it all onto Brielle. That last line landed in Brielle's chest like a spike, not because she felt sorry for Sloane, but because it proved she'd been chosen, the weakest name to dump it on. Gavin turned to the technician. Follow the money. I want to know where she was paid through. Sloane let out a dry laugh like someone out of places to hide. A shell company. Mallory allocation. They sent it through an intermediary account, and then into mine. I have a copy of one transfer, but I deleted the email. They told me to delete it. They always tell me to delete. Brielle remembered the subject line that had flashed and vanished, and her skin prickled. Because the man behind this didn't only manipulate people. He manipulated traces. Gavin glanced at the clock, eyes sliding over the time like he was staring straight into a falling blade. There was very little time left before 9 o'clock, and he made the decision without hesitation. Keep her alive. Don't let her disappear. I need her to trace Mallory. Then he turned to Brielle, his voice lower but sharp. Prepare the evidence packet. I'll respond to the partner before morning. The clock was still running, but for the first time since the red screen appeared, Brielle didn't feel like she was standing alone in front of the blade, because the truth had finally surfaced, and the person behind the name Mallory had just begun to be dragged into the light. Once the evidence packet had been sealed up to send to the partner before dawn, Brielle thought she'd have at least a few minutes to breathe. But in this world, every time the truth surfaced, the dark hit back, and Cyrus Mallory wasn't the kind of man who stood still while the vice gripped tighter around his empire. Gavin ordered Sloane locked down and cut off from all contact. The tech team started rebuilding the file backups, and Brielle was told to leave the port for a moment to get air, eat something, wash her face, and prepare for the long day ahead, a way to keep her alert past 9 o'clock. She stepped into the parking lot while it was still dark, the sky like black fabric not yet torn, the wind off the harbor carrying salt and metal, and inside her the clock kept running, no longer the rhythm of machines, but the count of fate. Her car sat in a far corner, an old sedan quiet as proof of a poor life, and when she opened the door, slid into the seat, and her hand touched the cold steering wheel, she realized she was shaking not from the cold, but from the certainty that a man like Mallory wouldn't let her walk straight out of the game. She started the engine and drove through the gate. The streets were empty, yellow light smeared across damp asphalt, and after only a few turns, the feeling of being followed returned, clear as a hand pressed to the back of her neck. Brielle checked the rearview mirror and saw a dark vehicle behind her, not close enough to draw attention, but keeping her pace like a shadow with intention. She changed lanes, and it changed lanes. She turned down a narrow street and it stayed with her. She tried to tell herself it could be coincidence, but her heart had learned to recognize this kind of tale, the kind that didn't want to be seen, and also wasn't afraid if it was. Her phone was no longer in her hand. She couldn't call anyone, and that made her feel stripped bare, like standing on the docks without a coat. She sped up just enough, not wanting a chase, only wanting to reach a busier area, but the road seemed to funnel her toward emptier stretches, and when she turned into a strip lined with abandoned warehouses, a second car suddenly slid out from an alley and cut across her front bumper, forcing her to brake hard. Tires squealed, her heart dropped into her stomach, and before she could reverse, the car behind surged up and boxed her rear like a clamp. Brielle looked around. No pedestrians, no traffic. Only a flickering streetlight and shuttered steel doors. She understood this was a trap that didn't need words, and they wanted her to know they could touch her whenever they wanted. Two men stepped out of the car in front. Solid builds, dark coats, unhurried, as if they weren't afraid of being seen, because there was no one here to see. One walked up to Brielle's driver window and tapped the glass with a fingertip, polite in a way that was terrifying, then motioned for her to roll it down. Brielle clenched the steering wheel, her mouth sand dry, and she didn't lower the window. She only shook her head, and in that instant the man's eyes went cold, and his hand settled on the door handle like he was ready to force it. Brielle heard blood thundering in her ears, and the thought flashed that this was how people disappeared. No gunshots required, only an alley and a few steel doors. Her door jerked when they tested it, and then an engine roared at the far end of the street. A different sound, stronger and decisive, and headlights swept in like a blade cutting through dark. A black SUV charged into the stretch like an animal provoked, stopped with a clean, hard brake, and immediately 2 large men got out, moving fast and precise as trained. No yelling, no theatrical weapons, only angles and pressure that forced the other men to step back. Brielle recognized them at once. Not police, not random Good Samaritans. Gavin's security, the shadows she'd seen trailing him at the port. One of them positioned himself in front of her door and signaled for her to keep it locked. The other spoke low to the men in the trap, and within seconds, the 2 ambushers backed off. No argument, no second try, as if they only needed to deliver the message and withdraw, because the message had been delivered clearly enough. The dark car behind eased back. The car in front turned away, and under the dull yellow streetlight, Brielle watched them vanish as fast as they'd appeared, leaving the alley empty but no longer calm, because fear had already touched her skin. A guard tapped her window and motioned for her to open the door, and when Brielle stepped out, her knees dipped slightly like someone who'd just escaped a fall. He didn't ask much. He only said, "Come with us, now." Brielle was moved into another vehicle, not for luxury, but for protection, and all the way there she stared out the window as the city slid backward, familiar streets turning suddenly strange, and inside her a hard truth rose like ice. Cyrus Mallory wanted her silent, not with a threatening text, but by letting her taste what it felt like to be taken. They brought her to a house in a quiet suburb, no prominent number, a soft yellow porch light, clean and minimal inside, like a place designed to make a person invisible. Gavin was already there, standing near a window, coat still on, tie loosened, eyes red from lack of sleep, but his spine still straight, as if he refused to allow himself to fold. When Brielle walked in, he didn't ask if she was scared. He only saw the tremor in her hands and said flatly, "They touched you already." Brielle nodded, her throat tight, and Gavin signaled his people to lock the doors and check the perimeter. Then he sat down in a chair, facing the entrance like a guard. The night wasn't over, but here, at least, there was no alley. Brielle sat on the sofa a few steps away, holding a cup of warm water while her hands still trembled faintly. And in the quiet of the safe house, she heard the clock in her head continue to run, but now she wasn't alone with it. Gavin didn't sleep. His eyes never left the door, as if the moment he blinked, the dark would slip inside. Brielle watched him for a long time, then spoke softly, not pleading, not performing, only placing a sentence between them. "You don't have to guard it alone." Gavin turned, and something flickered in his gaze, like the words touched a place he kept locked, a place where he believed trusting anyone was suicide. Brielle didn't move closer. She kept the distance, but her voice stayed strangely steady, like someone who had survived by learning how to stay calm. "I'm still here. I didn't disappear." That made Gavin's shoulders lower by the smallest fraction, a tiny sign of easing, as if in the middle of a storm there was one stone that didn't stand because it was fearless, but because it was decided, and in that stone he saw what he'd been searching for since the rainy night, someone who didn't lie, didn't run, and when cornered, still chose to turn back and fight. Near dawn, the tension in the safe house didn't ease. It only changed color, shifting from panic into something clinical and precise, like a surgical edge honed in silence, because everyone understood that 9 o'clock wouldn't wait for anyone, and tomorrow's Shark Tank wouldn't spare anyone who walked in empty-handed. Gavin still hadn't slept. He sat near the door like a living wall, his eyes red from lack of rest, but never dull, and Brielle sat a careful distance away, far enough not to make him feel crowded, close enough that he knew she hadn't vanished. When the cars outside rotated shifts, and the low murmur of radios sounded like insects in the dark, Gavin stood and motioned for Brielle to follow, offering no long explanation, only one short sentence, "Up to the roof." Brielle followed him up the back stairs, through a metal door opened by code, and the wind hit her face the moment they stepped onto the helipad, cold enough to sting her eyes, clean enough to pull her out of the tight, stale smell of fear inside the house. The city below was still half dark, half waking, roads like thin silver threads, the port lights in the distance still burning, and on the horizon a narrow strip of light, like a cut, slowly widening. Gavin walked to the edge of the roof and looked down as if he were staring at an empire being squeezed by an invisible name, and Brielle stood a few steps behind him, not daring to break the quiet, because she could feel it was the kind of silence that came before war. After a long time, Gavin spoke, his voice torn slightly by the wind but still clear. "I used to trust someone." He said it as if he were telling something old that had never become the past. "I put keys, money, roots, everything in their hands. I thought they were family. I thought they wouldn't use that trust to stab me." He let out a dry half-laugh. Not joy, only the memory of a wound. "But here, trust is a knife. You hold it, and one day you wake up and find it in your back." Brielle felt her throat tighten, not because she was hungry for his history, but because for the first time she saw a crack in Gavin's ice. A place where he wasn't the port boss, not the man who made rooms go silent, but a man who'd been betrayed so completely that betrayal became his religion. Gavin turned to Brielle, his gaze not soft, but carrying a rare bluntness. "Since the night you left that paper under my windshield wiper, I thought you were holding a knife. I thought you were another way for them to reach me. Tonight, when that red screen appeared under your name, I thought I was right." He paused, his hand tightening on the rail until the tendons rose. "I hate feeling made stupid. I hate the feeling of trusting wrong." Brielle didn't look away. She saw not only control in his eyes, but a real fear. The fear of a man who'd lived too long inside traps, afraid that if he loosened his grip for 1 second, everything would collapse. She drew a deep breath and spoke, not loud, but clear as a vow. "My whole life I've been stamped as untrustworthy. Not because I lie, but because I'm poor. Because I stay quiet. Because people look at my old coat and decide I'll do something dirty if I ever get the chance. That rainy night, I left my name because I couldn't stand living one more day under that stamp. Today, I came back when you tried to send me away because I knew if I walked out that door, I'd be stamped again. This time not only by someone like Sloane, but by the whole city. I'm going to fight, Gavin. Not because I want to live in your world, but because I want the name Brielle Hart to be mine." The wind whipped harder and threw Brielle's hair loose, but her voice didn't scatter. And that steadiness held Gavin still for one long beat, as if he wasn't hearing words so much as the spine he'd already read in that meeting room. He stepped closer, the distance closing not by pressure, but by a cautious decision. And then he held out his hand, unhurried, like a man not used to touching anything without first checking for a trap. His hand closed around Brielle's, brief but firm, not soft affection, but a hard promise. "Tomorrow you stand beside me, not behind me, not in the glass corner. Beside me." Brielle felt the warmth travel from his palm into hers, and strangely, it didn't weaken her. It made her stand straighter, as if for the first time a powerful man had said she wasn't expendable. Gavin released her hand after a beat, turned back to the city, and his voice sharpened into work again. "We don't have time for pity or anger. Mallory wants to break me with the fear of federal scrutiny, and by turning you into a dirty name. So we put the truth on the table before he gets to smile." He made a call right there on the helipad and spoke in short, clipped lines to someone unseen, ordering that before sunrise an internal witness be brought to the meeting point, someone who had worked for the shell company, someone who knew the money trail, and if that person was afraid, they should be reminded that Gavin had ways of making people less afraid. Brielle heard it and felt cold along her scalp, but she didn't ask, because the rule of silence had settled into her bones, and she understood that what Gavin did in the dark was meant to keep the legal part in the light. Gavin took Brielle back downstairs, opened a different laptop not tied directly to the locked system, and on it sat a file with a discrete name, Mallory Allocation, and he said it was an offline backup, beyond the reach of the red screen, held by someone Mallory still didn't know by face. Brielle stared at the title, feeling as if she was staring at the name that had flashed in her inbox like a ghost, and now sat there as something real. And Gavin added, "Tomorrow, when they open their mouths and ask for blood, we don't argue. We show them." Brielle nodded, her palm still remembering the grip on the roof. And inside her the clock kept running, but now it ran to a different rhythm. The rhythm of a plan, the rhythm of a counterstrike, the rhythm of no longer only trying to survive, but preparing to win. The meeting that morning was labeled Investment and Operations, but the moment Brielle walked into the room, she knew it wasn't a meeting. It was a tank full of teeth, and the long dark wood table in the center was simply a cutting board where people laid meat down and chose the best pieces. The door closed behind her, the lock clicking softly but final, white, cold light spilling over everyone's faces until they all looked blade sharp. And at the head of the table, Gavin sat upright, suit crisp, expression blank, as if a sleepless night were a detail not worth mentioning. Brielle stood beside him exactly as promised on the roof, not hiding in a corner, not slipping behind his back, and that alone made several eyes linger on her longer, eyes that were part assessment, part contempt, the kind that waited for one weak name to toss to the sharks. The people around the table weren't an official board, but their power was more real than paper. Investors, shipping partners, a few legal representatives, and one face Brielle needed only a single look to understand why the name Mallory had been drifting through everything like a ghost. Cyrus Mallory sat slightly across, one hand resting lightly on a thin folder, a faint smile, clothing understated but expensive. Expensive in the way of a man who didn't need to prove anything. He only needed to be mentioned, and other people automatically tightened. Cyrus opened with a politeness, so careful it was hard to challenge. He said everyone regretted the incident, that the market was sensitive to safety, that disruptions like this could trigger route reviews at any time. And then he dropped a line the way you drop bait. There are rumors investigators have caught the scent of something at this port. Federal scent, you understand. A few people around the table shifted. Chair legs brushed the floor, and Brielle felt cold run along her throat, because Cyrus didn't have to say it plainly, suggesting it was enough to let shared fear spread. Gavin didn't interrupt. He let Cyrus speak, like a man watching how an opponent sets a trap. Cyrus continued, voice still even, then slid a set of documents to the center of the table. These records were sent to me last night from a very reliable source. He stressed the words reliable source with a vague glance toward Brielle, as if to say reliability was something she didn't possess. On the large screen, Cyrus projected an edited video, a few selected frames of corridor camera footage, Brielle walking through an office area late at night, Brielle standing near a workstation with a bright screen, a system log showing user Brielle Hart performing a data deletion action, all stitched into a smooth story. The new girl pulled up. The poor girl, the pressured girl, the girl who broke it. Cyrus tilted his head, gave a small smile, and spoke as if he were addressing the common good. I'm not saying she meant to or not. I'm saying risk is risk. And in an environment like this, one mistake can trigger a search. Do we want a search to happen during business hours? A partner tapped a pen lightly against the table and asked Gavin directly whether he could guarantee there was no internal sabotage, whether he could guarantee the chain of control was clean, because if not, they would have to protect their own company first. And 9 o'clock had passed, but their deadline was still before the workday began, before a search was triggered under procedure. No one had to say tick-tock. It lived in the way people glanced at their watches, in the way their breathing sped up, in the way they held distance from Gavin, as if he now carried the smell of risk on his suit. Brielle felt anger rise, because Cyrus was using the fear of federal scrutiny to steer the entire table toward the easiest conclusion, and the easiest scapegoat was her. Gavin turned toward Brielle, not giving an order with words, only looking at her, and Brielle understood this was the moment she had to stand upright under the lights, not to protect Gavin, but to protect the truth. She stepped forward half a step, connected her device to the display, and spoke clearly, not rushed. No one is denying sabotage occurred, but it didn't come from carelessness, and it didn't come from the username pinned onto the log. This is physical evidence. On the screen, Brielle played the full corridor footage, uncut, showing a figure entering the server area using an old card at the exact window before the system was locked, and she paused on the frame where the door ID appeared, then switched to the physical door access log, where the badge ID was recorded and matched. Sloan Mercer. She continued by presenting the money path, a transfer diagram through a shell company, the name Mallory Allocation, appearing plainly like a shadow pulled into light, and Brielle said without flinching, "This is motive. This is the tool. This is how they used one person to stab the system and dump it onto my name." The room stirred. Some looked at Cyrus, some looked at Gavin, and for a moment, Brielle thought they'd reached the breaking point of the stitched story. But Cyrus only leaned back, clapped softly as if praising a performance, then smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Impressive. You caught Sloan. Congratulations." He leaned forward, his voice still polite, but carrying a thin blade underneath. "But do you think dragging a compliance employee into the light makes this port clean? You only touched Sloan. I touch the market. I touch fear. I touch procedure." He lifted a sheet of paper and slid it toward the partner. "If you don't clean this up before business hours, the search will proceed. And once a search proceeds, no one in this room stays untouched." Cyrus looked at Gavin, eyes bright and cold, as if to say this wasn't court. It was suffocation. And when that happens, Gavin, you'll be the most convenient sacrifice. Brielle felt the air thin in the room, because Cyrus had done what sharks did best. He didn't deny the truth. He reduced it to something not enough, then raised fear into law. And in that moment, Brielle understood this fight was only the first layer, and they would need a deeper strike if they didn't want to be swallowed alive right here on this dark wooden table. Cyrus finished his line with a knife of a smile, and the room sank into a silence that reeked of fear. The kind of silence people use to measure which side to stand on before the storm hits, and Brielle could feel the sharks tipping their weight toward the louder predator. Gavin didn't react right away. He let the silence hang for one more beat, long enough for Cyrus to believe he'd placed the final period, and then Gavin stood, unhurried, no table slamming, but the motion alone made a few people sit up straighter as if a string had been pulled. Gavin looked straight at Cyrus, calm in a way that was terrifying, the calm of a man ready to press a button. "You like the smell of federal, Mallory, so I'll give you the real scent," he said, his voice low, not raised, yet perfectly heard. Cyrus narrowed his eyes, the smile still on his mouth like he was watching a final act. But Gavin didn't look at him anymore. Gavin lifted one hand in a small gesture toward the door, and the meeting room door opened. 2 of Gavin's men came in first, and with them, a thin man with a pale face, clutching a briefcase like a life preserver, scanning the room as if it truly were a tank of sharks. Brielle recognized him at once as the internal witness Gavin had mentioned, the man from the shell company, the man who knew the money trail, the man Mallory hadn't managed to silence. Gavin pulled out a chair for him to sit, asked no long questions, only placed a small storage device in front of him, and said one line like an order to truth: "Talk." The man swallowed, his voice shaking but trying to stay clear. "I did intermediary accounting for a chain of shell companies. Mallory Allocation is one of them. We receive money from legitimate accounts, break it up, push it through layers, then pay it out under labels like consulting fees, audit fees, compliance fees. It's laundering." The whole table trembled in a subtle way, no one daring a big reaction, because once the word laundering is spoken, everything shifts from negotiation into survival. Cyrus let out a soft laugh, as if he wanted to turn it into slander. "My friend, you should be careful what you say." But Gavin cut him off with a look, no shouting, just cold enough to make a person go silent. Brielle saw Cyrus flinch. The smile wasn't natural anymore. Gavin glanced at Brielle for a beat, a reminder that this wasn't luck. This was layer 2, prepared, and then he looked back at the man. "Decryption key," Gavin said. The man nodded, opened the briefcase, pulled out a sheet of paper and a device. "I have the decryption key for the transaction chain, because I built the masking layer that hid the source, and I have the directive emails. The directives came from Cyrus Mallory, directly." He tapped a few commands, and the large screen shifted to a data interface. The transactions that had been meaningless numbers a moment ago now lit up like a tunnel, with the lights turned on. Shell company names, routes, dates and times, and the endpoint, an account linked to Cyrus's network. The man went on. "I was instructed to move a transfer into Sloan Mercer's account through an intermediary layer. The stated reason on paper was compliance consulting fees. The reality was payment for her to interfere with seals and sabotage the system, create grounds for a search, and force Gavin to surrender the contract." Brielle felt ice in her stomach but clarity in her mind, because this was the missing piece Cyrus had relied on when he smiled, the claim that they'd only touched Sloan, and now they were touching the money itself. Cyrus shifted forward, ready to speak, but Gavin raised a hand, this time not to stop Brielle, but to stop every excuse. Gavin reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out another small USB, and set it on the table like placing the final round. "The original," he said. "Mallory Allocation. Offline backup." He nodded to a technician, and when the file opened, it wasn't a ghost subject line flashing and vanishing anymore. It was a complete packet: fake consulting contracts, the shell company map, a list of beneficiaries, and scattered digitally signed directives, including one short passage that was enough to kill. Cold command language. Apply pressure for a search using seal suspicion. Shift responsibility onto a low-level employee. Keep Mallory clean in public. The room seemed to stop breathing. Several partners looked at Cyrus with new eyes, no longer admiration, but fear of being stained. Cyrus half rose, his face still trying to hold steady. "This is fabricated. This is your game, Gavin. You're making this up to damage my credibility." But Cyrus's voice no longer carried the same certainty it had when he tossed his bait. Gavin answered with one short line. Not loud, not a game. I didn't build it. I only opened what you hid. Then Gavin tipped his head toward the door. And this time, the people who entered weren't Gavin's men. They wore simple dark clothing, discreet insignia, moving without noise, yet turning the entire room cold. They didn't introduce themselves with speeches. They showed documents to the partners and the legal representatives, and they called the name cleanly, Cyrus Mallory. Brielle didn't know where they'd come from. She only knew Gavin had arranged for the federal scent Cyrus had been using as a whip to return as a chain. And when Cyrus turned and looked at Gavin, for the first time, real anger showed in his eyes. Not anger at being exposed, but anger at being played with his own rules. The officials stepped forward and informed Cyrus he was being detained on suspicion of money laundering and interference with chain of custody controls. And even if that was only the visible surface, it was enough to pull him away from the shark table before he could bite again. Cyrus tried to speak, tried to threaten, but Gavin only held his gaze, expression unmoved, and Cyrus understood his back channels were being cut in the same instant, because once the money trail is lit, every hidden door burns. In the corner of the room, Sloane sat like her bones had been removed, face pale, lips trembling, and when Gavin signaled his people, someone leaned in and said quietly that Sloane's brother had been moved to a safe place and was protected. Sloane collapsed, not because guilt had been forgiven, but because the last rope around her throat had finally loosened. A partner turned to Gavin, voice urgent but changed. If you guarantee chain of custody is cleaned immediately and the system is fully audited, we'll keep the contract. Gavin nodded once. No pleading, no thanks, only the final stamp. The deal stands. Brielle stood beside him and felt as if she'd just stepped out of a shark's mouth. And when she looked at the clock, she realized they'd saved the deadline before business hours, not by begging the fish, but by flipping the whole tank over and forcing the sharks to figure out how to breathe in open air. After Cyrus was let out, the room didn't explode into voices the way people might expect. It dropped into a strange hollow, the kind of hollow that follows after a beast has been dragged from its cage, and everyone can still hear its claws scraping inside their memory. The partners left quickly, shook Gavin's hand in short, clipped motions, their eyes avoiding anything too deep, as if they were afraid of getting more on them. A few legal representatives said procedural phrases and disappeared, and only when the last door shut did Brielle realize her shoulders ached from holding themselves tense for too long. The long night ended under a thin, pale morning light at the windows, but inside her the countdown still ticked. It had simply changed into the heavy pounding of consequences. The port hadn't collapsed, the deal had been kept, but the tiers would still need stitching. From the keycard system to the chain of custody, from the workplace injury report to the workers' fear that tomorrow another seal would be swapped, and someone else would get hurt because of someone's dirty game. Sloane was held back for statements and protection. She wasn't the compliance queen anymore, just a person stripped of every arrogant layer, folded in on herself like someone waking from a nightmare. And when she heard confirmation that her brother had been moved somewhere safe, her eyes reddened but no tears fell, as if even tears were a luxury in this world. Brielle didn't feel the bright kind of victory. She felt a fatigue as deep as stone. And at the same time, a different door opened inside her, a door back toward the small life she had lived before, where she only had to worry about hospital debt, about meals, about an old car, not about being touched in a dark alley by hands without names. Gavin brought Brielle back to the glass level where the red screen had swallowed her name, and this time there was no security pinching her in from both sides, no barked commands, only an odd quiet, the sound of power lowering its armor for a moment. Gavin stood by her desk, looking out at the port brightening below, then turned to Brielle and spoke low, not soft, but no longer as cold as before. "You can go." Brielle looked up, thinking she'd misheard, but Gavin continued, "Now that Mallory's been pulled out, whoever's left will look for the easiest part to bite. I can protect you, but protection is also a cage. If you leave here, I'll arrange it so you're safe, clean, back to your life. No one follows you anymore. No one calls you anymore." He didn't use the word debt. He didn't mention the note. He didn't mention favors. He only set the choice on the table like a man who rarely did, and that made Brielle's chest tighten, because part of her wanted to run right then, to go back to the familiar smallness, where fear at least had the shape of bills and a ringing phone. Brielle looked down at her hands and remembered the roadblock, remembered the holding room door clicking shut, remembered the forged log under her name, and then she remembered something else too. The feeling of standing beside Gavin at the shark table, looking straight at Cyrus, speaking the truth without being cut off. The feeling that the name Brielle Hart, for once, wasn't used like a rag, but stood under the lights as a human being. She understood that if she went back to her small life now, the system out there would stay the same. It would still choose the weak to grind down. Another day, at another table, another person would be stamped in her place, because loopholes like old keycards that still worked would remain if no one closed them. Brielle drew a deep breath. She didn't answer right away. She walked to the glass and looked down at the yard, saw workers starting their shift, saw forklifts running their routes, saw a man with a wrist wrapped still showing up for work, and inside her a decision rose, not from romantic bravery, but from a rough, practical principle. She didn't want today's win to be only a moment before everything snapped back to the old shape. Brielle turned and looked at Gavin, her voice steady. "I'll stay, but not the old way." Gavin didn't move, only watched her as if waiting for terms. Brielle laid them out one by one like stakes driven into the ground. The legal side has to be transparent. Every risk appendix needs a 2-layer cross-check process, and an offline copy outside the system. The old keycard loophole has to be sealed completely. The keycard list needs cyclical controls. No one keeps a card without authorization. And workers have to be protected. There's no more using them as shields because of paperwork games. If there's hazardous cargo, safety procedures get raised. It's not assumed they'll just take the hit. She paused for a beat and met his eyes. "And I don't work in fear. If I catch anyone trying to turn someone else into a scapegoat, I'll say it, no matter what level they're on." The air between them tightened, because what Brielle had just said was what many people never dared to say to Gavin. And Brielle knew she was drawing lines in front of a man used to giving orders, but she also knew that if she didn't draw them now, she'd become another version of Sloane, a person controlled by fear. Gavin looked at her for a long time, long enough that Brielle could hear the air conditioning and her own heartbeat. Then he nodded once, not reluctant, not mocking, like a man deciding to hand a piece of power to the thing he'd always doubted. "I accept. You'll be in charge of legal verification and process control. I'll lock old cards and change the system, and if anyone tries to use workers as shields, I'll handle it." He paused, his voice lower. "This is the first time I've yielded because I trust someone." Brielle didn't smile, but something inside her warmed very slowly, not because she'd been chosen, but because this time she was the one choosing to stay, not to be kept, but to keep her name and make this port a little less dirty, starting with something as small as an old card that would never work again. A few months later, when the rain over Baltimore fell in light drops, more like it was rinsing dust away than pounding the pavement as if it wanted to erase the whole city, Brielle stood by the glass of her new coordination office and looked down at the port with a feeling completely different from her first day here. The container routes moved in steady rhythm. The 2-layer control process had become habit. The keycard list was reviewed on a regular cycle, and there were no old cards quietly opening doors in the dark anymore. She'd paid off the hospital debt that used to tighten her chest every time her phone vibrated. She'd moved out of the damp apartment, where the pipes sounded like they were sighing, and now there was a small, safe home with solid locks in her name. No loans, no dependents. Her position was no longer a chair that could be shoved aside. It was a real control desk, a place where her voice was recorded not out of pity, but because she'd proven the value of transparency and backbone. Gavin had changed too, in a way that wasn't loud but was unmistakable. He was still controlled, still strict, but meals were no longer delivered in a sealed room with someone standing guard outside the door. And the nights he slept weren't broken by jolts every time a phone rang. He learned how to sit still without thinking about an invisible knife behind his back. He learned how to trust a system rebuilt on clear principles instead of fear. That afternoon, he drove the very SUV that had been scratched in that rainy night himself, told the security team to hang back, and pulled up in front of the small diner where Brielle used to buy cheap lunches to save every dollar. Brielle stepped outside, saw him leaning against the vehicle with a paper box of hot food still steaming in his hand, and she laughed, because an old memory had suddenly turned gentle. They sat in the car and ate like two ordinary people, beneath soft rain, no one guarding the door, no one talking about contracts or meetings. When the meal ended, Gavin opened the front compartment and took out a small box. Not flashy red velvet, just simple wood. He handed it to her, his voice steady as if he were passing over a document, yet his eyes carried a warmer light than before. This is the key. Brielle opened the box. Inside was a house key and a certificate with her name on it. She looked up, her mouth curving into a half-joking, half-stunned smile. I only scratched your car. Gavin looked at her, the thick ice gone from his gaze the way it used to be. You pulled me out of the dark. He didn't say it loudly, but it was enough for Brielle to understand that what she'd brought him wasn't a favor. It was a mirror, a principle, a way of standing straight in a world full of blind corners. They didn't trade long promises. They didn't need loud declarations. It was only a shared look of agreement that they were choosing each other through respect, through having seen each other at the weakest points and still deciding to stay. The rain kept falling, light and even, and the car rolled forward through streets that had once made Brielle feel small. Now she no longer felt erased inside a big city, because she knew her worth didn't live in a coat or a past. It lived in what she chose each day. Their story wasn't only the story of a woman and a powerful man. It was a story about keeping dignity when no one is watching, about daring to tell the truth when silence is the easiest road, and about changing a system starting from details most people would call small. The lesson Brielle carried wasn't that you should find a powerful person to lean on. It was that you should become someone who won't sell your own name even in the dark, because that kind of steadiness opens doors no one expects. If this story touched you, if you've ever stood in front of a choice between silence and speaking up, between walking away and staying to change something, tell us what you felt. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more inspiring stories every day. Tap like and share so more people can listen and find themselves in it. What do you think you'd choose if you were in Brielle's place? And what in your real life did this story make you think about? Leave a comment so we can listen from the deepest part of your heart. Hello, and see you in the next video. Wishing everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and see you again.